They tried to evict a single mom and an autistic man in 7 days. No exceptions, no mercy. But when Daniel stood up in that courtroom, his words didn't just freeze the room. They exposed a system designed to make people like them disappear. What he said next changed everything. How far would you go to protect your home when the law itself feels like the enemy? Mara stood in the hallway outside apartment 312, staring at the paper taped to her door. The edges were already curling from the moisture in the air, but the words were sharp enough. 7 days. She pulled it down slowly, folding it once, then twice, small enough to fit in her coat pocket where her daughter wouldn't see it. Through the door, she could hear Lily humming something off-key, probably that song from the cartoon she watched every morning before school. Mara's hand stayed on the doorknob, but she didn't turn it yet. The notice didn't say much. Lease termination. Building sale. Vacate by the 31st. No exceptions. She'd paid rent on time for 3 years, never complained about the radiator that clanked all night or the window that wouldn't close all the way. None of that mattered now. Someone with more money wanted this building, and people like her were just obstacles to remove. She thought about the savings account she'd been building, the one that was supposed to be for Lily's braces next year. It had $600 in it. Inside, Lily called out, asking if they were having spaghetti again tonight. Mara pressed her forehead against the door, feeling the cold metal knob dig into her palm. She couldn't let Lily see her face right now. Not with that look she got when she was trying not to cry, the one Lily had learned to recognize too well. The hallway smelled like someone's dinner, garlic and onions, and it made her stomach turn. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and breakfast had been half a granola bar. When she finally walked in, Lily was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, surrounded by colored pencils and a drawing of what looked like a house with a garden. She looked up with that smile that split Mara's heart in half every single time. Asked if Mara liked the flowers she'd drawn. Purple ones, because purple was magic. Mara sat down beside her, smoothing Lily's hair back, and said they were the most magic flowers she'd ever seen. Lily went back to coloring, and Mara watched her, memorizing the way her tongue stuck out a little when she concentrated. The apartment was small, but it was theirs. Lily's growth chart was marked in pencil on the kitchen doorframe, starting from when she was 3. Every birthday candle burn mark on the ceiling from that time Mara forgot to move the balloons. The loose floorboard near the window that creaked when you stepped on it, the one that always woke Mara up when Lily tried to sneak into her bed after a nightmare. You couldn't pack those things. You couldn't take them with you. Mara pulled out her phone and opened her email, scrolling past the overdue bill notices until she found the building management contact. She'd start there. Explain the situation, ask for more time, maybe work out a payment plan for something, anything. But when she opened the last email from the landlord's office, sent just that morning, there was a line she'd missed before. All inquiries regarding lease termination should be directed to Brennan Properties LLC. No phone number, just a generic email address that probably went to nobody. Lily asked if they could get pizza this weekend, the kind with the cheese in the crust. Mara said maybe, knowing they couldn't afford it, knowing she'd figure out a way to make it happen anyway, because that's what you did. You said maybe, and you made it work, and you didn't let them see you breaking. She pulled Lily close, breathing in the strawberry shampoo smell of her hair, and felt the folded paper in her pocket like a stone. That night, after Lily was asleep, Mara sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, searching for apartments in their price range. Everything was either too far from Lily's school or too expensive or already rented. She clicked through page after page, each one narrowing her options until there were none left. Her sister lived 2 states away in a 1-bedroom with her boyfriend. Her mother was in a facility. There was nobody to call, nowhere to go that wouldn't mean uprooting Lily completely. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside, slow and deliberate. They stopped near her door, then continued. It was probably Daniel from next door, the one who always organized his mail in the hallway, sorting it into piles she didn't understand. She'd seen him around for months, always polite, always careful not to make too much eye contact. He lived alone, no visitors. She wondered sometimes what that was like, to have nobody depending on you. The footsteps came back, stopped again. This time there was a soft knock. Mara froze, glancing at Lily's bedroom door to make sure it was closed. She wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again, gentler. She got up slowly, checked the peephole. Daniel stood there, holding something in his hands, looking at the floor. She opened the door just a crack. He didn't look up, but he spoke quietly, asking if she was okay. Said he'd noticed the paper on her door before she took it down. Said he got one too. Mara felt something shift in her chest, a weird mix of relief and new worry. She hadn't thought about who else might be losing their homes. She opened the door wider. Daniel held out what he was carrying, a folder thick with papers and tabs sticking out the sides. He said he'd been looking into some things, said maybe they should talk. Mara took the folder, feeling the weight of it, and noticed Daniel's hands were shaking slightly. He still wouldn't look at her directly, but there was something in his voice, something steady and sure that she hadn't expected. He said he wasn't good at this kind of thing, talking to people, asking for help, but he thought maybe they didn't have to do this alone. Mara glanced down at the folder, seeing words like housing code and violation and tenant rights printed on the tabs. She asked him if he wanted to come in. He hesitated, then nodded once. As he stepped inside, Mara noticed he paused at the threshold, like he was counting to 3 in his head before crossing it. She didn't know what was in that folder. She didn't know if it would change anything, but for the first time since she'd seen that notice, she felt like maybe she wasn't drowning alone. Daniel sat down at her kitchen table, opened the folder with precise movements, and started talking about patterns he'd noticed. The building was broken in ways that weren't supposed to be legal. He'd been documenting them for months, long before the eviction notices came. And now he thought maybe that documentation mattered. Maybe someone would listen. Mara sat down across from him, and for the first time in years, she let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, someone actually would. But in the back of her mind, a question curled up and stayed there. Why would he do this for people he barely knew, and what would it cost him to try? Have you ever had to choose between speaking up and staying safe? Tell me in the comments below. Topic 2. Meeting Daniel. Daniel's folder contained photographs. Not the kind you take with a phone, quick and careless, but deliberate ones with dates written in the corners and notes in tiny handwriting. Mara flipped through them slowly. A crack in the ceiling that ran the length of the 4th-floor hallway. Water stains blooming across Mrs. Chen's bathroom wall. The boiler room door that wouldn't close properly, hanging on one hinge. She'd walked past these things 100 times, trained herself not to see them, because seeing them meant adding them to a list of problems she couldn't fix. Daniel sat with his hands folded on the table, not quite still, his thumbs moving against each other in a rhythm only he could hear. He explained that he'd started taking pictures 8 months ago when his heat stopped working in January. The landlord had sent someone who looked at the radiator for 5 minutes and said it was fine. But it wasn't fine. Daniel had tracked the temperature in his apartment every day for 2 weeks, recording it in a spreadsheet. The average was 54 degrees. He showed her the spreadsheet on his phone, color-coded by date. Mara asked why he hadn't complained, hadn't pushed harder. Daniel's thumbs stopped moving for just a second. He said he had complained 3 times in writing like you're supposed to. The responses all said the same thing, that the building was old, that heating systems were complicated, that someone would look into it eventually. Eventually never came. So he'd bought a space heater with money he'd been saving for something else, and he started paying attention to all the other things that were wrong, all the other broken promises stacked up like the photographs in this folder. She noticed his apartment number written on the folder's spine. 313, right next door. They'd been living one wall apart for how long? A year maybe, and she'd never known his name until tonight. He'd never known hers either, probably. That's how it worked in buildings like this. You kept your head down, you didn't ask questions. You didn't get involved, because getting involved meant getting noticed, and getting noticed meant becoming a problem someone needed to solve. Daniel had somehow decided that being a problem was worth it. He told her about the electrical outlets in the stairwell that sparked when it rained, about the fire escape on the east side that had bolts so rusted they crumbled when he touched them, about the mold inspector who was supposed to come last March and never showed up, even though 5 tenants had requested it in writing. He had copies of those requests. He had copies of everything. Mara realized she was looking at someone who'd been building a case for months, maybe longer. Someone who saw the world in evidence and documentation while she'd been trying to survive it one day at a time. Lily's bedroom door creaked open. She stood there in her pajamas with the stars on them, rubbing her eyes, asking who was here. Mara's whole body tensed, that automatic shield coming up. But Daniel just looked at Lily, the way he'd looked at everything else tonight, careful and honest, and said his name, said he lived next door, said he was sorry if they were being too loud. Lily studied him with that unfiltered kid curiosity, then asked if he liked drawing because she liked drawing. Daniel said he liked organizing things, which was kind of like drawing but with numbers. Lily seemed to accept this as a reasonable answer. She climbed into Mara's lap, and Mara wrapped her arms around her, feeling how small she still was, how much she trusted that the adults around her would keep her safe. Daniel carefully closed the folder, like he understood that some conversations weren't for 7-year-old ears. He stood up slowly, said they could talk more another time, when it was easier. But before he reached the door, Mara asked him what he thought they could actually do with all this. With the pictures and the spreadsheets and the proof that the building was falling apart. Daniel stopped, his hand on the doorknob. And for the first time since he'd knocked, he almost looked at her. Not quite at her eyes, somewhere near her shoulder. He said he'd been researching tenant rights, said there were laws about habitability, said landlords couldn't just evict people from buildings that violated safety codes without fixing them first or providing relocation assistance. Mara felt something cold slide through her chest. She asked if he was sure, if he'd talked to a lawyer, if he knew how any of this actually worked. Daniel's hand tightened on the doorknob. He said no, he hadn't talked to a lawyer because lawyers cost money, and he didn't have money for that. But he'd read the housing codes for the city, all of them, and he'd cross-referenced them with the state regulations, and he was sure about what the law said. What he wasn't sure about was whether anyone with power would care. Lily had fallen asleep against Mara's shoulder, her breathing soft and even. Mara shifted her weight, feeling her arm going numb. She thought about waking up Lily and putting her back to bed, but she didn't want to move yet. Daniel was still standing there, and she realized he was waiting for something, some kind of answer she hadn't given. She asked him why he was doing this, why he cared. He could just take his eviction notice and leave quietly like the landlord wanted. Daniel's jaw tightened. He said he'd spent most of his life being told to be quiet, to not make things difficult, to adapt to the way other people needed the world to work, even when it hurt him. He'd gotten good at it, good at being invisible. But invisible meant people could pretend you weren't there when they did things that were wrong. It meant you watched injustice happen and told yourself it wasn't your problem because speaking up was too hard, too scary, too much. He finally looked at her, just for a second, and his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. He said he was tired of being quiet, tired of watching, tired of making himself smaller so other people could be comfortable. Maybe he didn't know how to fight this properly. Maybe he'd fail. But at least he'd know he tried. At least he'd be able to look at himself and not see someone who just accepted everything because it was easier. Mara didn't know what to say to that. Lily shifted in her arms, murmuring something about purple flowers in her sleep. Daniel opened the door quietly, started to leave, then paused. He said there was a tenants' meeting happening in 3 days. Someone named Mr. Okafor from 406 was organizing it. Daniel had seen the flyer in the lobby. He asked if Mara would come. If she'd bring her documentation too, rent receipts, maintenance requests, anything that showed how long she'd been here, how she'd followed all the rules. She said she'd think about it, which they both knew meant yes. Daniel nodded once and left, his footsteps precise and measured as they moved down the hallway toward his own door. Mara sat there with Lily heavy and warm in her arms, staring at the folder on her kitchen table. Inside, it was evidence, proof, the kind of thing that should matter, but she'd lived long enough to know that should and does were separated by a canyon most people never managed to cross. She thought about the meeting in 3 days, about standing up in a room full of neighbors she barely knew and admitting out loud that she was scared, that she didn't know what to do, that she needed help. The idea made her skin crawl. But then she thought about Daniel, how his hands had shaken when he knocked on her door, how he'd done it anyway, how he'd looked at her and said he was tired of being quiet. Maybe she was tired too, maybe tired enough to try. The property management office sat in a strip mall 20 minutes away by bus, wedged between a tax preparation service and a nail salon. Mara had never been inside before. She'd always paid rent online, sent maintenance requests through the portal, kept everything digital and distant. But the eviction notice had included a phone number, and when she'd called it that morning, a woman with a voice like she was reading from a script told her to come in person if she wanted to discuss her options. Options felt like a word with teeth. The waiting room smelled like air freshener trying to cover up mildew. There were 4 plastic chairs, all empty, and a receptionist behind plexiglass, who didn't look up when Mara walked in. She gave her name and was told to sit. On the wall hung a poster about fair housing laws, the kind of thing that probably made lawyers feel better but didn't actually protect anyone. Mara checked her phone. Lily was at school for another 3 hours. She'd told her teacher she might be late for pickup, invented a dentist appointment that didn't exist. The door to the back office opened, and a man came out, mid-40s maybe, wearing a polo shirt with Brennan Properties embroidered on the chest. He introduced himself as Kevin Brennan, said it like she should recognize the name. She didn't. He gestured for her to follow him, and she did, down a short hallway lined with filing cabinets. His office was small and cluttered, papers stacked on every surface, a computer screen showing what looked like spreadsheets. He sat behind his desk and didn't offer her a chair. She stood there feeling like a student called to the principal's office. Brennan asked what she wanted to discuss. Mara pulled out the eviction notice, unfolding it carefully even though he obviously knew what it said. She explained that she'd been a good tenant, never late, never complained. That she had a daughter in school nearby. That 7 days wasn't enough time to find a new place, not in this market. Not with what she could afford. Her voice stayed steady, professional, the tone she used at her job when customers got angry about things that weren't her fault. Brennan listened with his fingers steepled under his chin, that expression people get when they're waiting for you to finish so they can explain why you're wrong. He said he understood her situation, said it in a way that meant he didn't. Then he leaned back in his chair and explained, like he was doing her a favor by being honest, that the building had been sold. The new owners were planning renovations, big ones, the kind that required the building to be empty. It wasn't personal, it was business. The word business came out smooth, like it absolved him of anything resembling responsibility. He said all the tenants had received the same notice. Everyone had to leave. Those were the terms of the sale. Mara asked about relocation assistance. She'd looked it up the night before, sitting at her kitchen table after Daniel left, reading city housing codes until her eyes burned. There were rules about this. When a landlord sold a building and displaced tenants, there were supposed to be protections. Brennan's face changed just slightly, a tightening around his mouth. He said relocation assistance only applied in specific circumstances. This wasn't one of them. The sale had been in process for months. The tenants had been notified according to the law. Everything was above board. She felt her heart kicking against her ribs. She asked what circumstances would qualify. Brennan shuffled some papers on his desk, not really looking at them. He said if there were code violations that made the building uninhabitable, that would be different. But there weren't any violations. The building passed inspection last year. He said it casually, like it was settled fact, and Mara thought about Daniel's folder full of photographs, about water stains and broken fire escapes and temperatures recorded in color-coded spreadsheets. She mentioned the heating issues, the electrical problems, the mold that Mrs. Chen had complained about. Brennan's eyes went flat. He said every old building had maintenance issues. That didn't make it uninhabitable. He opened a drawer and pulled out a file, flipped through it with the bored efficiency of someone who'd had this conversation before. He said there were 3 maintenance requests filed in the last year for her unit. All 3 had been addressed. The records showed completed work orders. She wanted to ask what work had actually been done because she couldn't remember anyone fixing anything, but her throat felt tight. Brennan closed the file and looked at her directly for the first time. He said he appreciated that this was difficult, that he knew moving was stressful, but the law was clear. The notice period was valid. If she didn't vacate by the 31st, he'd have to file for formal eviction, and that would go on her record, make it harder to find another place. He said it gently, almost kindly, and that made it worse somehow. Like he was worried about her future while actively destroying it. Mara asked if there was anyone else she could talk to. Someone higher up, someone who could make exceptions. Brennan smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. He said he was the owner. There was nobody higher up. The decision was final. Then he stood, signaling the meeting was over. He walked her to the door, hand on her shoulder like they were old friends, and told her he really hoped she landed on her feet, that everything would work out. She wanted to shrug off his hand, but didn't. Just let him guide her out, let him close the door behind her. In the waiting room, the receptionist was eating lunch, some kind of wrap that smelled like onions. She still didn't look up. Mara stood there for a moment, feeling untethered, like if she moved too fast, she'd float away. She thought about what Brennan had said, about inspections and work orders, and everything being above board, about how easy it was to make paperwork say whatever you needed it to say. She pulled out her phone and texted Daniel, asked if his documentation included dates for those supposed inspections. The bus ride back felt longer than 20 minutes. Mara stared out the window at strip malls and parking lots, at people going about their normal days. She thought about how Brennan had looked at her, that mix of pity and dismissal, like she was a problem that would solve itself if he just waited long enough. Like she'd give up because people like her always gave up. People like her didn't have lawyers or time or the kind of anger that stayed hot enough to fuel a fight. Her phone buzzed. Daniel's response was brief. He had the inspection dates. They didn't match the violations. Some of the photos he'd taken were from after the building supposedly passed. He'd documented the dates carefully. He asked if she wanted to meet before the tenants' meeting tomorrow night. Said there were other people who might have evidence too. Said maybe together they had enough. Mara closed her eyes, felt the bus sway beneath her, and thought about Brennan's hand on her shoulder, about being told to hope everything worked out. She typed back yes, she'd meet him. Yes, she'd bring whatever she had. And then, because she needed to say it to someone, she added that the landlord was lying, that his records were wrong, that he'd looked her in the eye and lied like it was nothing. Daniel's response came fast. Just 3 words. They always do. Mara pressed her forehead against the cold bus window and wondered how many other people Brennan had sat across from, how many other families he'd explained business to, How many times he'd wished them luck while showing them the door. Topic 4. Daniel's quiet observation. Daniel watched from his kitchen window as Mara got off the bus. She moved differently than she had this morning, slower, like something had been taken from her that she didn't know how to carry the absence of. He stepped back from the glass before she could look up and see him standing there. People didn't like being watched. He'd learned that young, learned it over and over in all the small ways people's faces changed when they noticed him noticing. But watching wasn't about intrusion, it was about understanding. It was about seeing the patterns everyone else missed. He'd been tracking those patterns for 11 months now. Not just in the building, though, that's where it started. He tracked Brennan properties too, public records, business filings, property transactions. It turned out Kevin Brennan owned 14 buildings across the city. In the last 2 years, he'd sold 6 of them. Every single one followed the same sequence. Delayed maintenance, minimal repairs, sudden sale, mass evictions. Then 6 months later, luxury renovations and rent that tripled. It was a formula. Efficient, legal, devastating. Daniel had spreadsheets for all of it. Purchase dates, sale dates, average displacement time. He'd even found news articles about 2 of the previous buildings, brief mentions buried in the local section about tenant advocacy groups protesting. Nothing had come of those protests. The tenants had left. The renovations had happened. The buildings now had websites with virtual tours and amenity lists, rooftop gardens, fitness centers, studio apartments starting at $2,000 a month. Daniel had called one of the leasing offices, pretending to be interested. The woman on the phone had been cheerful, said the building used to be a real dump. His own eviction notice was taped to his refrigerator, held up with a magnet shaped like a cat that his sister had given him 3 Christmases ago. He looked at it every morning while making coffee, letting the reality of it settle into his bones. 7 days. He'd lived in apartment 313 for 4 years, longer than he'd lived anywhere since childhood. He knew which floorboards creaked, which water pipes hummed at night, which hours the building was quietest. Leaving meant starting over, meant learning a new space, new sounds, new patterns, meant being untethered again. But it wasn't just about him. That's what people didn't understand when they looked at him and saw someone who preferred being alone. Alone didn't mean uncaring. He cared deeply, maybe too deeply, about things most people trained themselves to ignore. He cared about Mrs. Chen on the 4th floor, who'd lived here for 18 years and spoke limited English and probably had no idea what legal rights she had. He cared about the Okafor family with their 3 kids who played in the hallway every evening. He cared about Mara and her daughter with the purple flowers. Yesterday, he'd gone to the library and printed out tenant rights pamphlets in 5 languages: English, Spanish, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Somali. He'd left them in a stack by the mailboxes with a note that said, "Information about your rights." This morning, the stack was gone. He didn't know if people had taken them or if building management had thrown them away. Probably both. But at least he'd tried. At least the information had existed in the world for a moment, available to anyone who needed it. Daniel opened his laptop and pulled up the folder labeled Building Documentation. Inside were subfolder organized by category: heating and cooling, electrical, plumbing, structural. Each subfolder contained photographs, dates, descriptions. He'd been systematic about it the way he was systematic about everything. Each photo had metadata intact, proving when and where it was taken. Each description was factual, precise. No emotion, just evidence. Courts liked evidence. At least, that's what the internet said. He'd never been to court. The idea made his chest tight. His phone buzzed. Mara's text. He read it twice, processing the information. Brennan had lied about the inspection. That wasn't surprising, but having confirmation felt important. It meant the pattern was holding. It meant Daniel's predictions about how this would unfold were accurate. He typed his response carefully, deleting and rewriting 3 times before sending. Communication was hard. Text was easier than speaking, but still hard. You couldn't see people's faces, couldn't tell if they were really asking what they seemed to be asking. He stood up and paced his apartment, counting steps. 17 from the kitchen to the bedroom, 12 from the bedroom to the bathroom, 8 from the bathroom to the front door. He'd measured it when he first moved in, needed to know the dimensions of his space, needed it to make sense in numbers. Now he was going to lose it. They were all going to lose their spaces because someone with money had decided these apartments were worth more empty than full of people. The tenants' meeting was tomorrow night. Daniel had been to the community room once for a building-wide notice about water main work last spring. It had been crowded and loud, everyone talking over each other, too much sensory input. He'd left after 5 minutes, but tomorrow he'd have to stay. Have to speak, maybe. The thought made his hands shake. Public speaking was near the top of his list of things that felt physically painful. But Mara was going. Mrs. Chen might go. The Okafors were organizing it. He couldn't let them face this alone. He pulled up a document on his laptop. Speech notes. He'd started it last night after leaving Mara's apartment. Bullet points of what he wanted to say. Facts about the building. Facts about tenant law. Facts about Brennan's history. Facts were safe. Facts didn't require emotion or persuasion. You just stated them, and people either accepted them or didn't, except that wasn't true. He'd learned that the hard way. People ignored facts all the time when the facts were inconvenient. They'd rather believe a comfortable lie than an uncomfortable truth. Daniel saved the document and closed his laptop. Through the wall, he could hear Lily singing, that same off-key tune from the cartoon. The sound came through muffled, but clear enough to recognize. In 2 weeks, maybe 3 if Brennan was feeling generous, that sound would be gone. Someone else would live in apartment 312. Someone who could afford whatever rent Brennan decided to charge after the renovations. Someone who wouldn't know that a little girl had measured her height on the kitchen doorframe or that her mother had fought to keep her safe here. He thought about systems, how they were supposed to work. Laws and regulations and codes that existed to protect people like them. But systems were only as good as the people enforcing them, and the people with power to enforce things were usually the same people who benefited from not enforcing them. That was the real pattern, the one nobody wanted to acknowledge, the one that made Daniel's careful documentation feel like shouting into a void. But he'd shout anyway. He'd stand up in that community room tomorrow and present his evidence and hope that someone with power would care. Hope that maybe this time the pattern would break. Hope was uncomfortable for him. It was imprecise, unmeasurable. But Mara's text had sounded like she was drowning, and Daniel knew what drowning felt like. So he'd hope. He'd document. He'd speak, even though it hurt. Because the alternative was watching good people lose their homes while he stayed quiet, and he'd already decided he was done being quiet. The community room hadn't been used for anything but storage in months. Someone had pushed the old furniture against the walls, creating a space in the center with mismatched chairs arranged in rough rows. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered every few seconds, casting everything in an unstable brightness. Mara arrived 10 minutes early with Lily, who immediately gravitated toward a pile of forgotten board games in the corner. The room smelled like dust and something chemical, maybe old cleaning supplies. It made the whole gathering feel temporary, like even the building knew they didn't belong here anymore. Mr. Okafor stood near the front, talking quietly with his wife. He was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of presence that made you trust him without knowing why. His oldest daughter, maybe 14, sat behind a card table with a notebook open, ready to take notes. Mara had seen the Okafors in passing, exchanged hellos in the elevator. They had 3 kids total, always well-dressed, always polite. She'd never considered what it must cost them to keep that appearance up, to make it look easy. People filtered in slowly. Mrs. Chen with her daughter translating softly beside her. A young couple from the second floor Mara didn't know. An elderly man with a cane who moved carefully to a chair near the wall. By 6:30, maybe 20 people had gathered. Out of 64 units, Mara did the math automatically. Less than a third. The rest had already given up or were too scared to show their faces or didn't believe anything could change. She understood all three reasons intimately. Daniel arrived last, slipping through the door like he was trying not to disturb the air. He carried a messenger bag that looked heavy, worn leather with a broken buckle. He scanned the room, and when his eyes landed on Mara, something in his shoulders relaxed slightly. He sat 3 chairs away from her, leaving empty space between them. She noticed he positioned himself near the aisle, an easy exit if things got overwhelming. He pulled a water bottle from his bag and set it precisely on the floor beside his chair. Mr. Okafor called the meeting to order. His voice was steady, practiced. He thanked everyone for coming, said he knew it took courage to be here. Then he laid out the situation plainly. They'd all received eviction notices, 7 days. The building was sold. New owners wanted them out. But he'd been researching, and there were questions about whether the eviction process was legal. Questions about whether the building met the safety standards required to house tenants in the first place. He looked around the room, asked if anyone had documentation of problems, complaints that went unaddressed, repairs that never happened. The room stayed quiet. Mara watched people look at each other, waiting for someone else to speak first. Mrs. Chen's daughter whispered something, and Mrs. Chen shook her head firmly. The young couple on the second floor stared at their hands. Nobody wanted to be the first. Nobody wanted to make themselves a target. Mara felt Lily lean against her leg, humming that tune again, oblivious to the weight pressing down on everyone else. Daniel raised his hand. Not high, just lifted it from his lap, a small gesture that somehow cut through the silence. Mr. Okafor nodded at him. Daniel stood slowly, pulling his messenger bag onto his lap. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the wall behind Mr. Okafor's head and started talking about the heating system. How it failed last January. How he'd filed complaints. How the temperature in his unit averaged 54 degrees for 2 weeks straight. His voice was flat, factual, like he was reading a grocery list. But the numbers landed hard. 54 degrees, 2 weeks, winter. He pulled out his folder, the same one he'd shown Mara, but thicker now. More photographs, more documentation. He'd made copies, he said. Enough for everyone. He passed them to Mr. Okafor, who started distributing them around the room. Mara took one, flipping through pages of evidence. Dates, temperatures, photos of the broken boiler, photos of the radiator that leaked rust-colored water, photos of the space heater Daniel had bought himself because the landlord wouldn't fix the problem. Someone in the back asked why they should believe this mattered, said landlords got away with this stuff all the time, said even if the building had problems, even if they could prove it, so what? They were still getting evicted. Fighting would just make it take longer, cost more. Better to cut their losses and move on. The voice belonged to a middle-aged man Mara recognized from the 3rd floor. He looked tired, defeated, like he'd already lived this story before and knew how it ended. Daniel was still standing. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, a small, repetitive movement. He said the man was probably right. That fighting might not change anything. But fighting might also be the only thing that did change anything. He explained that he'd researched Brennan Properties, that this wasn't the first building they'd done this to, that there was a pattern. 6 buildings in 2 years. Same process every time. He'd brought printouts of the property records, news articles about previous evictions. He spread them on the card table like cards in a hand of poker. Mrs. Chen's daughter stood up, speaking for her mother. Said, Mrs. Chen had complained about mold in her bathroom 2 years ago. Someone came and painted over it. That was the repair. Just paint. Now the mold had spread behind the wall. You could smell it when you opened the medicine cabinet. The daughter's voice shook with an anger that felt fresh and old at the same time. She said her mother had been scared to push harder, scared of retaliation, scared of making trouble. But trouble had found them anyway. What was the point of staying quiet now? The young couple from the second floor spoke up next. Water damage in their ceiling, brown stains spreading across the plaster. They'd reported it 8 months ago. The work order said it was fixed, but it wasn't. They'd had to put buckets under the leak every time it rained, had to bleach the mold that grew in the corners. The woman's voice broke when she said they had a baby, 7 months old, that she worried about what breathing that air was doing to him. Her husband held her hand, jaw tight. Mr. Okafor was writing everything down, his daughter filling pages with complaints. The room felt different now. Less defeated, still scared, but scared together, angry together. Mara glanced at Daniel, who'd sat back down. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white. She realized how much that speech had cost him. How standing up and talking to a room of near strangers went against every instinct he had. But he'd done it. He'd gone first. He'd made space for everyone else to follow. Someone asked what they should do next. Mr. Okafor said they needed to contact the City Housing Authority, file formal complaints, document everything they'd shared tonight. He looked at Daniel's folder, at the photographs now spread across multiple laps, said they needed this kind of evidence from everyone. Dates, photos, emails, anything that proved the building was substandard and the landlord knew it. If they could show a pattern of neglect, they might be able to delay the evictions. Might be able to force Brennan to provide relocation assistance or actually fix the problems before anyone had to leave. The meeting ended with a plan. Everyone would gather their documentation by the end of the week. Mr. Okafor would contact a legal aid organization he'd found. They'd meet again in 3 days to decide their next steps. People stood slowly, talking in small groups, some hopeful, some still skeptical. Mara stayed in her chair, watching Daniel pack his folder carefully back into his bag. Lily had fallen asleep on the floor near the board games. She'd have to carry her home. The legal aid office called back 3 days later while Mara was restocking shelves at work. She stepped into the break room, pressing her phone tight against her ear to hear over the hum of the refrigerator. The woman on the line introduced herself as Patricia Vance, said Mr. Okafor had forwarded their documentation. Her tone was professional, but not cold. She asked how many tenants were involved. Mara said 20, maybe more. Patricia was quiet for a moment, then said she'd need to review everything carefully. That legal aid was stretched thin, that housing cases took time they didn't always have. Mara asked what that meant. Patricia explained that they handled hundreds of cases, that eviction defense was only part of what they did, that even when they took a case, winning wasn't guaranteed. Courts favored landlords. Judges had heard every sob story. Unless the evidence was ironclad, unless they could prove willful negligence that rose to the level of making the building uninhabitable, the best they could hope for was a delay. Maybe 30 days, maybe 60 if they got lucky, then everyone would have to leave anyway. The break room suddenly felt smaller. Mara leaned against the wall, staring at a poster about workplace safety that had been there so long the corners had curled. She asked if Patricia had looked at Daniel's documentation, the photographs, the temperature records, the inspection dates that didn't match. Patricia said she had, said it was good work, thorough. But good documentation didn't always translate to legal leverage. Landlords had lawyers who knew how to explain away anything, how to make serious violations sound like routine maintenance issues, how to frame tenants as unreasonable complainers looking for a payout. Mara felt something cold settle in her stomach. She asked what they needed then. What would make the difference? Patricia sighed, and it sounded genuine, not performative. She said they needed someone willing to testify, to stand up in court and walk a judge through the evidence, someone credible who could stay calm under cross-examination, someone the judge would listen to. And ideally, she said, they needed media attention, public pressure. Because judges were elected officials who cared about perception, and landlords were business owners who hated bad press. Her break ended in 4 minutes. Mara told Patricia she'd talk to the others, ask about testifying, ask about going to the media. Patricia gave her an email address and said to send any additional documentation they gathered. Then she said something that stuck. She said most tenants gave up before it got to court. That's what landlords counted on. That's why the system worked the way it did. Not because tenants didn't have rights, but because exercising those rights required resources most people didn't have. Time, money, energy, the ability to fight while your whole life was falling apart. Mara ended the call and stood there holding her phone. Through the break room door, she could hear her manager calling for someone to help at the register. She thought about testifying, about standing in a courtroom and explaining to a stranger in a robe why she deserved to keep her home, about having some lawyer tear apart her story, looking for inconsistencies, trying to make her seem unreliable or dishonest. The idea made her want to throw up. That evening, she knocked on Daniel's door. He answered quickly, like he'd been standing nearby. His apartment was exactly what she'd expected, neat, organized, everything at right angles. A desk with 2 monitors, both displaying spreadsheets, bookshelves arranged by height and color. It was calming in a way that surprised her, like walking into someone's mind and finding it made sense. Daniel offered her tea. She said yes, even though she didn't really want any. Sitting at his small kitchen table felt easier than standing. She told him about the call with Patricia, about needing someone to testify, about needing media attention. Daniel listened without interrupting, his hands wrapped around his own mug. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if she thought he could do it. Testify. Mara looked at him, at the way his eyes fixed on a point just past her shoulder, at the tension in his jaw. She said honestly that she didn't know, that it would be hard, that lawyers would try to trip him up, make him look unreliable, that being autistic might work against him in court, no matter how solid his evidence was. Daniel nodded slowly, said he'd thought about that, about how people perceived him, how they assumed that because he didn't make eye contact or respond to social cues the way they expected, he must be confused or incompetent. He'd spent his whole life watching people dismiss him before he opened his mouth. But he also said that's exactly why he had to try, because if someone like him, someone who followed every rule and documented everything and did it all correctly, couldn't get justice, then the system really was broken. And maybe that was worth proving. Mara felt something shift in her chest. She asked about the media part. Daniel had already thought about that too. He pulled up a browser on his phone, showing her local news websites. 3 of them had done stories in the past year about tenant displacement. He'd contacted 2 reporters, sent them preliminary information about Brennan Properties and the pattern of evictions. One hadn't responded. The other had said she was interested but needed more than just data. She needed faces, stories, people willing to go on camera. The idea of cameras made Mara's skin crawl. She imagined Lily seeing her on the news, imagined her daughter's classmates talking about it, imagined future landlords Googling her name and finding videos of her begging to keep her apartment. Daniel must have seen something in her face, because he said they didn't have to decide tonight, that maybe there was another way. But his voice didn't sound convinced. A notification popped up on Daniel's computer screen. An email. He glanced at it, and his expression changed, something between confusion and alarm. He opened it fully, read for a moment, then turned the monitor so Mara could see. It was from someone named Marcus Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, who didn't live in the building. He was a lawyer, not a housing lawyer, he clarified in the email, but he knew people who were. He'd heard about the situation from his mother and sister. He wanted to help. The email was long, detailed. Marcus explained that he worked in corporate law but had connections in tenant advocacy. He'd reviewed the documentation Daniel had sent Mr. Okafor. He thought they had a case, a real one, if they moved fast. He offered to coordinate with legal aid, to help prepare testimony, to reach out to his network of attorneys who did pro bono work. He said his mother had lived in that building for 18 years, that she'd raised him there, that she'd been too scared to fight, but he wasn't. The email ended with his phone number and a request to call as soon as possible. Mara read it twice. Daniel was staring at the screen like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. She asked if he knew Marcus. Daniel shook his head, said he'd met Mrs. Chen's daughter at the meeting, but didn't know she had a brother, didn't know the brother was a lawyer. It felt like luck, except Mara wasn't sure she believed in luck anymore. Maybe it was just that, when you finally asked for help, sometimes people answered, sometimes the right people heard you. Daniel picked up his phone, stared at it for a moment, then set it back down. He said he wasn't good at phone calls, asked if Mara would do it. She almost said no, almost said she wasn't good at this either, at asking strangers for help, at believing things could actually get better. But Daniel was looking at her with something that might have been hope, and she realized they'd already come too far to stop now. So she took his phone, pulled up the number from the email, and pressed call. It rang 3 times before a voice answered, professional and alert. Mara took a breath and started explaining who they were and why they were calling and how much they needed someone to believe them. Marcus Chen's office sat on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown that made Mara feel small just walking through the lobby. She'd taken the afternoon off work, told her manager it was a family emergency, which wasn't quite a lie. Daniel met her at the security desk, his messenger bag clutched tight against his chest. They signed in, got visitor badges, rode the elevator in silence. The walls were mirrored and Mara avoided looking at her reflection. She didn't want to see how scared she looked. Marcus was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. But when he shook their hands, his grip was warm and his smile reached his eyes. He led them to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Mara had never been this high up before. From here, you couldn't see the broken sidewalks or the boarded-up storefronts. Everything looked clean and possible. He'd brought help. 2 other lawyers sat at the long table, a woman named Jennifer, who specialized in housing discrimination, and a man named Robert, who did tenant advocacy full-time. They had Daniel's documentation spread across the table, photographs organized into neat stacks. Jennifer was making notes on a yellow legal pad. Robert was reading something on his laptop, occasionally muttering under his breath. Marcus gestured for them to sit and asked if they wanted coffee. Daniel said yes. Mara said no, then changed her mind. Jennifer spoke first, said the documentation was excellent, that Daniel's attention to detail had given them a foundation most tenant cases never had, but she needed to be honest about their chances. Housing court was brutal. Judges saw dozens of eviction cases every day. Most tenants didn't show up. Most who did show up lost. The system was designed to move fast, to clear dockets, to favor property owners who had lawyers and knew the process. What they had was good, but good wasn't always enough. Robert added that they needed to prove the violations made the building legally uninhabitable, not just uncomfortable, not just substandard, actually dangerous. The heating failure in winter was strong. The electrical issues were concerning. But Brennan's lawyers would argue these were isolated incidents, maintenance problems that any old building experienced. They'd present work orders showing repairs were attempted. They'd make it look like the tenants were exaggerating, looking for a payout or trying to avoid paying rent. Mara felt her chest tighten. She asked what they needed to prove it wasn't isolated. Marcus pulled out a tablet, swiped through screens until he found what he wanted. He said they needed patterns, Multiple tenants with the same problems, documented complaints going back months or years, evidence that Brennan knew about the issues and deliberately ignored them. And they needed testimony from someone who could present this information clearly, someone a judge would find credible under pressure. Daniel was staring at his hands. Mara knew what he was thinking because she was thinking it too. They were asking him to be that person, to stand in court and have his credibility questioned, to have lawyers imply he was lying or mistaken or unreliable, to have his autism used against him. Jennifer must have sensed the tension because she said they had options. They could have multiple people testify, spread the burden, make it harder for Brennan's lawyers to dismiss everyone. Marcus leaned forward, said his mother would testify, that she was terrified but willing, that 18 years in that building meant something. Robert said Mr. Okafor had already agreed to speak, that he'd been documenting problems since he moved in 5 years ago. They had other tenants ready too, the young couple with the baby, the elderly man with respiratory issues from the mold. They weren't alone in this anymore, but Daniel was their strongest witness. Jennifer said it plainly. His documentation was systematic and thorough. His temperature records had metadata. His photographs had timestamps. He could walk a judge through months of evidence in a way that was objective and verifiable. If he could handle the pressure, if he could stay calm when Brennan's lawyers tried to rattle him, he could be the difference between winning and losing. Daniel looked up, not at Jennifer, but at the windows, at the city spread out below them. He asked how long he'd have to testify. Robert said maybe an hour, maybe 2 with cross-examination. Daniel's hands started that small, trembling Mara had seen before. He asked if he could prepare, if he could practice, if someone could tell him exactly what questions to expect. Marcus said yes to all of it. Said they'd do mock examinations. Said they'd make sure he knew what was coming. Mara watched Daniel process this, watched him weighing the cost against what they stood to lose. She wanted to tell him he didn't have to do it, that they'd find another way. But she knew there wasn't another way. The system demanded this, demanded that they bear themselves in front of strangers, demanded that they prove they deserved basic dignity. Daniel must have reached the same conclusion because he nodded once, slowly, and said he'd do it. The meeting shifted then. Jennifer started walking them through court procedure. What to wear, how to address the judge, when to speak, and when to stay quiet. She said the hearing was set for next week, that Brennan had filed for formal eviction, and they were countering with a motion to dismiss based on habitability violations. The judge could rule immediately or request an inspection. Either way, they needed to be ready for anything. Robert handed them a folder. Inside were copies of all the documents they'd need, housing codes highlighted, tenant rights summaries, contact information for everyone involved. He said to review everything multiple times, to be so familiar with the evidence they could recite it in their sleep, because Brennan's lawyers would try to confuse them, to make them doubt their own memories. The only defense was absolute certainty. They spent 3 more hours in that conference room, going over testimony, practicing questions, building a timeline of every complaint, every ignored request, every promise Brennan had broken. Mara's head ached from concentration. Daniel filled an entire notebook with notes, his handwriting small and precise. Marcus ordered sandwiches that nobody really ate. The sun moved across the sky outside those huge windows, and Mara thought about how strange it was that their lives were being decided in a room like this, high above the streets where they actually lived. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and stress. Mara arrived 40 minutes early with Lily, who'd insisted on wearing her favorite dress, the one with butterflies. They sat on a bench in the hallway outside courtroom 3, watching lawyers in expensive suits hurry past with briefcases and urgent phone calls. Daniel showed up exactly on time, wearing a button-down shirt Mara had never seen him in. He looked uncomfortable, kept tugging at the collar. "Mr. Okafor arrived with his whole family, his wife holding their youngest daughter's hand tightly. Mrs. Chen came with both her children, her son Marcus, still in his work clothes from an early meeting. The young couple from the second floor, Emma and Josh, had brought their baby, who gurgled happily in his carrier, oblivious to the weight of the day. Other tenants filtered in, some Mara recognized, some she'd never spoken to before. They gathered in that hallway like soldiers before battle, exchanging nervous glances, nobody quite sure what to say. Patricia Vance from Legal Aid arrived carrying 2 accordion folders stuffed with documents. She gathered everyone in a tight circle, speaking quietly, said the hearing would be procedural at first. The judge would hear arguments from both sides, then testimony. She reminded them to answer only what was asked, to stay calm, to not let Brennan's lawyer bait them into anger. Anger made you look unreasonable. Courts rewarded composure, even when composure felt impossible. Brennan showed up 10 minutes before the hearing with 2 lawyers, both men in their 50s with silver hair and watches that caught the light. They looked relaxed, confident, like this was just another Tuesday. Brennan himself barely glanced at the tenants. He scrolled through his phone, occasionally laughing at something on the screen. Mara felt rage bloom hot in her chest. Their lives were entertainment to him, background noise. The bailiff called them in. The courtroom was smaller than Mara expected, wood paneling and fluorescent lights. The judge's bench sat high at the front, empty for now. Rows of seats on either side, gallery benches in back. Patricia directed them where to sit. Brennan's team took the opposite side, spreading papers across their table with practiced efficiency. The baby started fussing, and Emma rocked him gently, whispering something soothing. Judge Catherine Reeves entered, and everyone stood. She was maybe 60, grey hair pulled back, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She sat without ceremony and told everyone else to sit. Her voice was neutral, businesslike. She called the case. Patricia stood, introduced herself, outlined their motion to dismiss the eviction based on multiple housing code violations. Brennan's lead lawyer, a man named Sutton, countered that the eviction was lawful, that the building sale was legitimate, that any maintenance issues had been addressed according to procedure. Judge Reeves looked tired already. She asked Patricia what evidence she had. Patricia called Daniel to testify. He stood slowly, walked to the witness stand with that careful gait Mara had noticed before, like he was counting steps. The bailiff swore him in. Daniel's hand shook slightly as he placed it on the Bible. He sat, adjusted the microphone, stared at a point somewhere above the judge's head. Patricia started gentle, asked his name, how long he'd lived in the building, what apartment. Daniel answered in that flat, precise tone. Then she asked about the heating failure. Daniel pulled out his notebook, opened to a marked page, started reciting dates and temperatures. January 4th through January 18th. Average temperature 53.7 degrees. Complaints filed on January 5th, 8th and 12th. No response from management until January 20th, 2 days after he bought his own space heater. Judge Reeves was writing. Sutton looked bored, waiting for his turn. Patricia asked about the documentation. Daniel pulled out the folder, the same one he'd shown Mara that first night. Handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Photographs organized chronologically, each one labeled with date, location, description. The judge flipped through slowly, her expression unreadable. Patricia asked about other violations. Daniel listed them methodically. Electrical outlets that sparked, fire escape bolts rusted through, water damage in 4 separate units, mold growth documented with photographs. Each problem reported multiple times with no resolution. He had copies of every complaint, every work order that claimed repairs were completed when they weren't. His voice never wavered, just facts, laid out like bricks in a wall. Then Sutton stood for cross-examination. He smiled, friendly and disarming. Asked Daniel if he had any formal training in building inspection. Daniel said no. Sutton asked if he was qualified to assess whether electrical issues posed actual danger or were merely cosmetic. Daniel said the outlet sparked when touched. That spark meant electrical discharge. That electrical discharge near water was dangerous. Sutton moved on quickly. He asked about Daniel's autism, said it casually, like it was relevant context. Asked if Daniel sometimes had difficulty understanding social situations, if he ever misinterpreted people's intentions. Patricia objected immediately. Judge Reeves sustained it, told Sutton to move on, but the question had landed. Mara saw some of the people in the gallery shift uncomfortably, saw doubt creep in like smoke. Sutton pivoted to the space heater, asked why Daniel bought one if he'd already filed complaints, implied that buying the heater meant the heating problem wasn't serious. Daniel was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he said he bought it because he was cold, because waiting for repairs meant suffering, because people shouldn't have to choose between freezing and spending money they didn't have. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Sutton kept pushing, asked if Daniel had ever been late on rent, if he'd ever violated his lease terms, if he had any personal grievance against Mr. Brennan beyond the maintenance issues. Daniel answered no to everything, but his hands were gripping the edge of the witness stand now, knuckles white. Mara could see him struggling, the courtroom noise and pressure closing in. She wanted to stand up to stop this, but Patricia had warned them not to react. Sutton was wrapping up, thanking Daniel with false courtesy, when Daniel did something unexpected. He didn't stand to leave the witness box. He just sat there, staring at his hands, and said he had something else to say. Judge Reeves looked up from her notes, surprised. Sutton froze mid-step. Patricia looked confused, but didn't object. The courtroom went silent in a way that felt fragile, like the wrong sound would shatter everything. Daniel started talking, and his voice was different now. Quieter, but somehow steadier. He said he understood what Sutton was trying to do. Make him seem unreliable because he was autistic. Make his evidence seem questionable because he saw the world differently than other people. He said he'd spent his entire life having people dismiss him before he finished speaking, having them assume that because he didn't make eye contact, he must not understand what was happening around him. But understanding wasn't about eye contact. It was about paying attention. It was about noticing patterns. He'd noticed that Mr. Brennan owned 14 buildings, that 6 had been sold in 2 years following the exact same process. Delayed maintenance, minimal repairs, sudden sale, mass evictions. He'd noticed that every time the tenants left quietly because fighting seemed impossible, because the system made them feel small and powerless and wrong for even asking for basic dignity. He looked up then, not at the judge, but at Brennan himself. Said he'd watched him scroll through his phone in the hallway, watched him laugh at something while families sat nearby trying not to cry. Said Brennan saw them as numbers on a spreadsheet, units to clear, obstacles between him and profit. But they weren't numbers. Mrs. Chen had lived in that building for 18 years. She'd raised her children there. She'd built a life there. His voice got stronger. He talked about Mara and Lily. About watching through his window as they came home from school every day, Lily skipping ahead, Mara carrying grocery bags that looked too heavy. About the routine they had, the safety of coming home to a place that was theirs. He said home wasn't just walls and a roof. It was knowing which floorboard creaked. It was marks on a doorframe, measuring a child's growth. It was the sound of your neighbor's music through the wall, annoying sometimes, but also proof you weren't alone. Judge Reeves was watching him now, completely focused. Sutton had sat down, looking uncertain. Daniel kept going. He said he understood property rights, understood that Brennan legally owned the building, but ownership came with responsibility. You couldn't collect rent from people while letting their homes fall apart. You couldn't ignore broken heating in winter and call it acceptable. You couldn't treat human beings like they were disposable because someone offered you more money. He pulled out another document, one Patricia hadn't seen before. His hands shook as he unfolded it. He said he'd filed a Freedom of Information request with the city, got records of every inspection Brennan Properties buildings had passed in the last 3 years. Then he cross-referenced them with complaint records. The inspections all happened on dates when no tenants were home. The inspectors spent an average of 12 minutes per building. Some of the past inspections came days after documented violations. The judge leaned forward, asked to see the document. Daniel handed it over through the bailiff. While she read, Daniel kept talking, said he wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a building inspector, wasn't someone people usually listened to, but he knew how to research, how to document, how to see patterns that others ignored. And the pattern here was corruption. Not the dramatic kind you saw in movies. The boring, bureaucratic kind, where people with power protected each other and nobody checked if the paperwork matched reality. He said something that made Mara's throat close up. Said he'd been scared to speak up. Scared of exactly what Sutton had done, using his autism to make him seem unreliable. Scared of being dismissed again. But then he'd thought about what scared him more. The idea of staying quiet while good people lost everything. The idea of watching injustice happen and telling himself it wasn't his responsibility. The idea of being someone who documented problems but never tried to fix them. His voice dropped to almost a whisper, but the courtroom was so quiet everyone heard him. He said the building had been his sanctuary, his safe place in a world that was usually too loud, too bright, too unpredictable. Leaving meant starting over. Meant learning new sounds and new routines and new ways to feel safe. But he'd realized something. Home wasn't just about him, it was about all of them. And if he could help protect that for even one family, the fear was worth it. Daniel looked directly at Judge Reeves then, really looked at her, making eye contact even though Mara could see how much it cost him. He said she had the power to enforce the law, or to enforce what was right. Sometimes those were the same thing. Sometimes they weren't. But she got to choose. She could rule in favor of property rights and profit margins, or she could rule in favor of human beings who'd done everything right and still ended up here, begging not to be thrown out of their homes. He said that dignity wasn't something you earned through perfect behavior. It wasn't something you lost by being poor or different or powerless. It was something every person deserved simply because they were human. And what Brennan was doing, what the system was allowing, was stripping that dignity away piece by piece until people forgot they ever had it. Until they accepted that this was how things worked. That might made right. That money mattered more than people. Daniel's hands were shaking violently now. His voice cracked. But he didn't stop. He said he was tired, tired of being quiet, tired of watching. Tired of a world that told him he was too different to matter, but demanded he follow all the rules anyway. He said if speaking up today meant losing everything, at least he'd lose it knowing he tried. At least he'd look at himself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. The silence after he finished was absolute. Judge Reeves sat back in her chair, studying him. Brennan's lawyers were conferring in urgent whispers. Patricia looked stunned. Mara realized she was crying, tears running down her face without sound. Daniel stood slowly, like his legs might not hold him, and walked back to his seat. He didn't look at anyone, just sat down, pulled his notebook onto his lap, and stared at it. Judge Reeves didn't speak for what felt like an hour, but was probably 2 minutes. She read through Daniel's documentation again, flipping pages slowly. Then she looked at Brennan, really looked at him, and asked if his counsel had any response to the inspection records. Sutton stood, fumbled through papers, said they'd need time to verify the documents. The judge said he had until tomorrow morning. Court would reconvene at 9. Everyone was dismissed. The hallway outside erupted in anxious chatter. Patricia pulled Daniel aside, asking where he'd gotten those inspection records, why he hadn't shown them earlier. He said quietly that he'd wanted to be sure first, that he'd only received them yesterday, that he'd stayed up all night cross-referencing everything. Mara watched him explain, saw how exhausted he was, how the effort of that speech had drained something essential from him. She wanted to hug him, but knew he wouldn't want that right now. That night, nobody slept. Mara lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Lily breathe in the next room. She kept replaying Daniel's words about dignity, about home, about choosing to speak even when the fear felt unbearable. She thought about all the times she'd stayed quiet, at work when managers treated her badly, with Lily's father before he left, with landlords and bureaucrats and anyone who had power over her life. Staying quiet was supposed to keep you safe, but it just made you disappear. The next morning, the courthouse was different. The hallway was packed with people. Tenants from other Brennan buildings had shown up, somehow having heard what was happening. Local news cameras set up near the entrance. A reporter tried to interview Mara, but she shook her head, moved past. Inside the courtroom, Judge Reeves was already at the bench when they entered. She looked like she hadn't slept much either. Sutton stood immediately, said his team had reviewed the inspection records, that there were irregularities they couldn't explain, that Mr. Brennan maintained he'd followed all proper procedures, but acknowledged that perhaps the city's inspection process had been inadequate. He proposed a settlement, 60 days for tenants to relocate. 1 month's rent as assistance. Repairs to be completed before any new tenants moved in. His voice lacked its earlier confidence. Judge Reeves asked Patricia what her clients wanted. Patricia looked at Daniel, at Mara, at all the tenants sitting in those hard wooden benches. Then she said they wanted their homes, not 60 days, not money to leave quietly. They wanted the building fixed while they stayed in it. They wanted enforcement of the housing codes that already existed. They wanted what they'd been promised when they signed their leases. Safe, habitable apartments at the rent they'd agreed to pay. The judge was quiet again. Then she did something Mara had never seen in any courtroom drama on television. She asked Daniel to approach the bench. He stood slowly, walked forward. She spoke to him directly, not through lawyers, not through procedure. Asked if he understood that even if she ruled in their favor, the fight wasn't over. That Brennan could appeal. That repairs would take months. That living in a construction zone with a landlord who resented them would be hard. Daniel said yes, he understood. But hard was different from impossible. Hard meant they'd have to be patient and vigilant and willing to document every promise and every failure. But impossible meant giving up before trying. He'd rather choose hard. Judge Reeves nodded, almost smiled, told him to sit down. Then she started talking, and her voice had an edge to it that made everyone lean forward. She said she'd been a housing court judge for 16 years, that she'd seen thousands of eviction cases, that the law gave landlords enormous power and tenants very little, that most days her job was just managing the speed at which people lost their homes. But occasionally a case came along that reminded her why the law existed in the first place. Not to protect profit, to protect people. She said Daniel's documentation was the most thorough she'd ever seen from a tenant. That the inspection records raised serious questions about enforcement. That Brennan Properties had a pattern of behavior that suggested willful neglect rather than innocent oversight. She was ordering an immediate city inspection of the building, a real one, with proper notice to tenants. Until that inspection was complete and all violations were addressed, the evictions were stayed. Everyone could remain in their apartments. Furthermore, she was referring the inspection records to the city's housing authority for investigation. If inspectors had been falsifying reports, that was corruption that extended beyond one building. She looked at Brennan directly, said that property ownership came with legal obligations, that those obligations weren't optional or negotiable, that if he couldn't maintain his buildings to code, he had no business renting them to families. The courtroom exploded, not loudly but emotionally. Mrs. Chen started crying. Emma clutched Josh's hand. Mr. Okafor closed his eyes, lips moving in what might have been prayer. Mara felt Lily grab her leg, asking what happened, what did the judge say? She knelt down, hugged her daughter, and whispered that they got to stay home, that everything was going to be okay. Brennan's lawyers were packing up quickly, not meeting anyone's eyes. Brennan himself looked stunned, angry, like he couldn't believe the system had actually worked against him. Patricia was shaking hands with Marcus, with Robert, with Jennifer. She caught Mara's eye across the room and mouthed, "We did it." But Mara was looking at Daniel, who sat alone in his seat, staring at his hands, looking like he might cry or collapse or both. She walked over, sat beside him, didn't say anything at first, just sat there while the courtroom slowly emptied. Finally, Daniel spoke, voice barely audible. Said he couldn't believe it worked, that he'd been so sure they'd lose. That speaking up would cost them everything and change nothing. Mara said sometimes courage was enough. Sometimes one person refusing to be quiet was all it took to make others brave too. Outside, the news cameras were waiting. The reporter who'd tried to interview Mara earlier approached them, asking if they'd tell their story. Daniel looked terrified. But then he looked at the other tenants, at families who'd fought beside him, at Mrs. Chen, who was smiling for the first time Mara had ever seen, at Lily, who was drawing purple flowers on the back of a court document with a crayon someone had given her. He took a breath and said yes, he'd tell their story. The interview was awkward. Daniel stumbled over words, couldn't look at the camera, had to restart sentences. But the reporter was patient. She asked about the documentation, about what made him decide to fight. Daniel said something simple. Said home wasn't a place you owned. It was a place that knew you, where people noticed if you were gone, where children measured their growth on door frames and neighbors heard each other through walls, and that sound meant you weren't alone. That night, back in apartment 313, Daniel sat at his desk and updated his spreadsheet. Changed the status from pending eviction to resolved stayed. It felt too simple for everything that had happened. But maybe that's what justice looked like when it finally arrived. Not dramatic, just a status change, a stay of execution, a chance to keep living in the place you called home. He heard music through the wall, Lily singing that off-key tune. He smiled despite his exhaustion. Tomorrow the inspectors would come. Tomorrow the real work of holding Brennan accountable would begin. Tomorrow there would be more documentation, more vigilance, more fighting for basic dignity. But tonight the building was still theirs. The families were still together, and for once speaking up hadn't cost him everything. It had given him something he'd been missing his whole life. The knowledge that his voice mattered, that he mattered. That home was anywhere people chose to see you, really see you, and fight to keep you there. If Daniel's courage to stand up when everything felt impossible touched your heart, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay quiet. Give this a like if you believe everyone deserves dignity and a place to call home. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between staying safe and speaking up? Your story matters, and I want to hear it.